In 2021, the global automobile industry made $1 trillion bet. Every major CEO told the same story. Electrical vehicles were inevitable. Demand would be infinite and the internal combustion or IC engine was finished. Wall Street believed it, governments funded it, and markets rewarded it. 3 years later, the story has completely changed. That bet has turned into one of the most expensive miscalculation in modern industrial history. Today, when companies like Ford sell an electric vehicle, they are not making money. Instead, they are losing tens of thousands of dollars per unit. Rental companies are dumping EV fleets like anything. European factories are shutting down and governments are quietly rewriting their own climate targets. This raises a critical question. If electric vehicles are truly the superior product, why does the business model collapse the moment subsidies disappear? Now, this answer has nothing to do with batteries or charging speed. It has everything to do with politics. This is not a story about a climate change or an ideology. Even this is not a story about consumer hesitation to buy. This is a case study in a political economy about what happens when a government try to force a political timeline onto an economic reality. To understand how this happened, we need to understand and go back in a moment where all this EV fantasy had just started to begin. So how the EV fantasy was created? 3 years ago, 2021-2022 era, the global auto industry entered a political financial illusion. After Tesla crossed $1 trillion valuation, legacy automakers and manufacturers convinced themselves that electric cars or electrification was not just about the future. This was an unavoidable destiny. Executives and car manufacturers did not merely promise new EV products, they also promised new political alignment. Volkswagen announced that nearly 70% of its European sales would be electric by 2030. Even then later they increased the target to be 80%. Stellantis company pledged a complete exit from all these old combustion engines, and even General Motors, historically one of the most conservative manufacturers, declared that it would abandon all combustion or petrol engines entirely by 2035. These commitments were not driven by consumer demand. These were driven by policy incentives like subsidies. Because interest rates were near zero, government was offering policies and subsidies, and even climate ambition was being converted that into an industrial strategy. So in the environment, whole optimism was cheap. Capital was abundant and even political approval mattered more than commercial viability. So when did this politics stopped paying attention, and why are the EV now drowning? A shock came from the United States. In September, Donald Trump removed the $7,500 consumer tax credit for electric vehicles. So at the same time, emissions regulations were rolled back. What disappeared overnight was the artificial demand that was created to support the EV market. This was not a gradual slowdown, it was a policy reversal. Due to policy reversal, demand collapsed immediately. Europe reached the same conclusion but by a different path. They faced pressure from domestic automakers. As soon as that happened, European Commission diluted its 2035 ban on IC engines. A hard ban became a 90% target After all this, and in the political language, this was a flexibility. In the business term, they used it as a retrieve. So governments were quietly admitting that their green industrial strategy are now colliding due to economic reality. So now you might ask this question: the strategy they applied years ago that you build now and the people will adopt has failed, and the answer is yes. For years policymakers and CEOs shared only one assumption, that if manufacturers build electric vehicles, consumers would eventually adopt them. This assumption has now totally collapsed. The EV transition did not fail due to technology barrier. It has failed due to economic barrier only. So the global EV sales are still rising almost entirely due to China. In North America, if you see, sales are constantly declining. In Europe, only see you the sales are declined or are there only where incentives remain. So instead of one global revolution, now the industry face three realities: that there is a price war in China due to this EVs constantly upgrading, policy retreat in Europe because of then only EV are constantly maintaining, and the demand fatigue in the US. That's why you can see EV are constantly increasing. Otherwise, across all the global nations, you can see EV's demand is constantly decreasing. Did the customers agreed before 2020 to 2021 era? Even then, consumers were never fully convinced, because electric vehicles always cost more than upfront, and even they depreciate faster, and even they demand lifestyle adjustment. For policymakers, these are actually temporary inconvenience. For buyers, if you buy an electric car for 10-20 years, these are permanent risk. Buying an EV in 2022 turned out to be less likely buying a durable asset, and people bought it because they thought a rapidly aging gadget. In the UK only, you can see in used car market, 1 year old electric models lost significantly more value than their petrol equivalents. This was not an innovative risk, it was just due to policy induced depreciation. And if you see, not just consumers, even the professionals have walked starting away from EV, like fleet operators understood this first. Rental companies rely on predictable depreciation. When repair costs rose and resale values collapsed, all the rental companies and the fleet operators started exiting EV. Hertz company dumped 20,000 EVs from its fleet. This was an ideology? No, this was called an asset management. So remember this: when professionals walk away from a product category, markets and consumers should always listen to this. So you might have the question, are the manufacturers also seeing this reality? And the answer is yes. Soon now automakers have also followed this strategy. Ford announced a $19.5 billion write-down tied to its EV strategy. Sales of the electric F-150 collapsed by more than 70%. General Motors booked billions and billions of dollar charges. Volkswagen prepared to close German factories for the first time in its history. These were not adjustments. These were surrender without subsidies and masking cost, and even the depreciation. Large EVs simply do not work in Western EV market. So you might ask the question, why do they have large fleets like the truck in the combustion era? Because large vehicles were highly profitable then. In the EV era, all these large vehicles are financial disasters, because batteries are the most expensive component. Bigger vehicles require larger battery, and larger batteries means margins have to collapse. So customers refuse to pay prices. Automakers cannot cover the cost. Even the Detroit's response has been so much revealing that they have already told that future will be no longer fully electric. It is going to be hybrid only. Extended range vehicles quite bring combustion engines back, not due to ideology, but they have to necessarily break the combustion engines due to high cost and the batteries cost, and due to the even the ecosystem adaptation due to this also. If you see that western EV demand has never been organic even before, it was already purchased. How? Because if you remove subsidies, sales always collapse, and if you reintroduce subsidies, sales return. So all the artificial demand has been created due to EV. Now this cycle of stop start makes the long term vision for any automaker or any manufacturer impossible, because manufacturers are being asked to invest billions based upon demand, but due to policies or subsidies, this demand can be disappear with a single election. So the politics only created the boom 3 years ago. Now politics is busting the boom now only. So is the China ahead in this? Yes. Even though the West debates all this politics policy, China dominates the battery supply chain. In fact, it controls most amount of global lithium-ion cell production and even the critical minerals. This is not a gap tax credits which can fix. It is a structural monopoly of China, and Western automakers are increasingly resemble assembly plants for Chinese technology. Can tariffs slow this outcome? Answer is yes, but they can reverse it. The answer is no. Now, the real reason you can understand from all this scenario that this is not the end of electric vehicle. It is the end of the belief that the politics can override economics indefinitely. For years, auto industry has always followed political timelines instead of consumer behavior. Now that experiment is now unwinding. As a Ford executive admitted, we are looking at the market as it is today, not as everyone predicted it would be. This sentence literally explains everything. Now if you did enjoy the case study, please suggest what we can improve and what next topics you want to there, and do subscribe and like.